I think it's important to remember biology and remember nature. Now, in nature, things grow, but if you notice, things don't grow out of control. Things don't get onto a pattern of runaway growth. If that happens, then you get, cancer or some excess, which is destructive for that ecosystem. The problem is that our ideas of growth, while originally having come from biology and from human biology, watching children grow is a joyous thing. But beyond a point, we know that once children turn into adults physically, then they have to stop growing physically. Then the growth, if it happens in some non-physical or metaphysical direction, right? Now, the problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, both in the real world as well as in how the real world is interpreted, which is to say, in mainstream professional economics, growth has a very specific meaning. And that meaning has to do with the expansion of production and productivity, measured very precisely from the perspective of the large private enterprises that dominate the economy, or the large state, which is central to the modern economy, because the state also, remember, experiences great benefit from growth because its revenues go up and it has control of larger budgets and so on. Now, the definition of growth in modern economics for a very long time has to do with the growth of the gross domestic product, GDP, right? You can measure that in gross terms, you can measure that in net terms, net of depreciation of capital, etc. You can divide it by the population to calculate per capita growth and so on. There are various variants of fundamentally the same notion. Now, something very unique and peculiar happens in human history with the Industrial Revolution. Since the 18th century, humanity has been on a path which makes a big rupture with all previous societies. And the rupture comes about because of a certain kind of technological change which comes into place. And I'll have more to say about this later. A certain kind of technical change comes into place, a certain kind of inventive mode of being becomes normal to humanity. And this inventive mode relies on an energy source which is fundamentally finite, right? So you start with coal and steam-based engines and steam-based technologies in the 18th century. You arrive at petroleum by the last, 40 years of the 19th century. By the 20th century, you are well into the petroleum age. And even now, you are stuck with the coal and petroleum age. They are not past us by any stretch of imagination. The only little variant, the little curl on the energy picture is the arrival of natural gas, but even that is actually fairly finite. All these, when you think about it, are non-renewable sources of energy, right? And the particular kind of technique, the particular kind of technological mode of invention that comes into place in the 18th century relies fundamentally on these non-renewable sources of energy. So for a quarter of a millennium now, humanity has been mining resources, that is to say, non-renewable energy, which the earth took millions and millions of years to form. That's why we call them fossil fuels. We burn away in a matter of days and weeks what it took the earth millions of years to make. So there is a fundamental mismatch between the cycles of energy production of nature when it comes to these non-renewables and the modes of exploitation and the rates of extraction which humanity has come to be dependent on. We assume these things as part of the industrial age. The other variation which you see in the 20th century, post the 1920s or so, is the search for nuclear fuel and fission and later on fusion and so on. We can discuss that later, but fundamentally, humanity still relies on non-renewable resources, non-renewable energies, and metals and minerals to carry out its industrial ambitions. So growth, when it takes place in the economy, assumes all this. We measure the outputs. We do not have such an accurate measure of the inputs, except in a private sense. That is to say, corporations keep their budgets in money terms quite clear. But the accounting is in money terms, it's not in energy terms, it's not in terms of waste generated, it's not in terms of inclusive of waste heat created, etc., etc. There's a whole set of inefficiencies which are social and ecological, which are built into the industrial process, which are not accounted for. So we have a problem, and we don't have a small problem, we have a planet-wide problem, because our way of life depends so much on everything that comes from non-renewable energy sources. So to reiterate my main point here, the definition of growth, or our expectation of what growth should be, needs to change. A child should grow into an adult, that is healthy, but an adult shouldn't want to grow into a Superman. That is not only unhealthy, it's destructive. And if you watch nature carefully, you can learn this lesson. If you just rely on the recent successes of technology, your mind is going wrong. Well, to be fair, the success of the Industrial Revolution has been so dramatic that it goes on. And the beliefs that we have today have been formed by the success of Western civilization when it comes to the development of industry on the basis of technology which is rooted in the kind of techne that I was talking about from the era of the 18th century. And the material prosperity which it has brought to the Western world and to some parts of the rest of the world in recent times is so dramatic and so unprecedented in human history in terms of accessible wealth that you can't not be impressed by it. Purely as a phenomena, it is dramatic for humanity to be living with as much wealth as it does today. Just look around you. Just look at the number of flights people take. There are people in this world who take 100 or 200 flights a year. When would that have been ever possible before in human history? Any part of the globe is accessible within 24 hours. You can get on the phone with anybody you wish. You have technologies like information technology and telecom, which put you in constant contact, communications with the whole world. This kind of thing is totally unprecedented. Now, once you have a certain energy base which is reasonably assured for the foreseeable future, and perhaps even a little beyond the foreseeable future, and you've got a whole set of industries and power utilities and so on running on that foundation, then people's lives come to rest on those assumptions. You don't question them. Whether it's a choice of where you're going to work, how far from your parents, how far from your children, which city, which country, etc. All these things rest on a bedrock of assumptions about technology, economy, and energy, which we take for granted. Now, what the ecological crisis is in fundamentals is it is asking us to question these very fundamentals. It is trying to say, through the floods, through the cyclones, through the hurricanes, through the climate change, if we read the tea leaves right, what it is saying to us is these bedrock assumptions are no longer bedrock. They are floating. They're floating assumptions. In other words, they can drift away from us, right? So that is the kind of crisis that we are in. And that's how I interpret it, at least. Ideas about growth do not exist in the abstract, as we know. They exist in a context. They exist in a context which was created in the last 200, 250 years. You go back before that, and you will find throughout human history, while children have grown into adults and so on, so on, so on, you don't find societies obsessing about growth, nor are they confused about it. Okay, it's not on the horizon. It's not in the paradigm, so to speak. Now, the other thing which is important to talk about in this context is the dramatic rise in human population that has happened in the last 200 years, but especially in the last 100 years. What that has done is it has not only raised expectations for the species as a whole, it has increase the aggregate requirements of resources and climate space and pollution space for human populations, which are simply in numerical terms larger in magnitude, much larger in magnitude. It's one thing to think about a planet with 1 billion people, another thing to think about a planet with 7 billion or 9 billion people. So how did this come about? Now, it's a long, complex story, but demographically, what people are agreed upon is that while death rates have come down quite significantly in the last 100 years, let's say, thanks to medical advances, improvements in sanitation and so on, since the 19th century, I'm talking about improvements in sanitation, not from before that. So from the classical industrial era of Europe, when sanitation was awful in Europe, things improved in the 20th century, and as third world countries also started getting industrialized and getting polluted and getting dirty, improvements in public health and so on have brought about a reduction in the death rate, other than the medical advances, things like vaccinations, smallpox, cholera vaccinations, etc. Now, this reduction in death rate has, however, not been matched by a reduction in birth rates. So birth rates have continued to be high. They were rising till a while ago. Now at least they flattened out, but they're still high, especially in large populous countries like India or China. What that means is that population continues to grow, although at a much slower rate, and the expectation is it'll stabilize somewhere around 9 billion people by the middle of the century. That's huge, and that's unprecedented. And again, that's a child of the industrial age. This scale of population could not be supported by a pre-industrial society with the sort of technologies and industries and access to energy that they had. But now that we do have access to these energies and technologies, we believe that we can and we should sustain such large populations. That is the ethical imperative, it appears. However, just to raise the uncomfortable fact that the non-renewable energy base on which these industrial technologies and economies have arisen in the last quarter millennia is not here for keeps now. That we understand. So in the era of peak coal or peak oil or peak energy, we have to think in terms of what is the maximum number of people that we can afford to be on this planet. It's a difficult ethical question as to how do we handle this large population, but clearly we need a population policy which has gone into some sort of remission since the early 1990s, I would say, because before that there is a lot of population rhetoric coming from Western countries. After the end of communism, they realized that large populations in the rest of the world also mean potentially large markets for them. And suddenly the corporations and the whole advertising industry start looking upon population as a positive resource. So there's a very interesting twist which takes place in public discourse when the corporations realize there's money to be made from more people in the market. But in terms of the resource crunch, these people will matter, increasingly matter. And one thing is very clear to me and to many people is that not everybody can live like the United States of America. India has 16% of the world's population. It has 1% of the world's cars. Would it be fair to say that India should also have 16% of the world's cars? Would Delhiites be happy with 16 times more cars on our streets, or even 8 times, or even 4 times as many cars as we have now? Would you be happy to drive 2 hours to work and drive 2 hours back and sometimes be stuck in jams for 4 hours. Would that be a happy solution? So there are ways in which the ecological crisis is making us think very fundamental questions about ethics, about human society, about how do we take decisions, what is fair, what is unfair, etc. So to cut a very long story short, we've come to think this way about growth because of historical reasons. But the facts which have emerged as a result of the unfolding of the dynamic of history, those facts are pointing to a future in which that history will not be the norm. Something else will happen. Something sometimes predictable, very often unpredictable, is likely to happen because of the ecological imbalances which have been stirred up, because the earth has been mined for things which it should not have been mined for at this rate. And that has become clear now. Well, before I answer your question, one fact needs to be underlined and placed before anybody who thinks about this, in India especially. Our forefathers and foremothers, when they were fighting for this country's freedom, they never talked about growth. They never talked about development, for that matter. You find any page from Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar, so many freedom fighters before 1947, not talking about the country's problems in terms of growth or development whatsoever. And the best example of that is the Indian Constitution itself. When you turn the pages of the Constitution, you can do a search on the World Wide Web and you'll find that the word growth actually does not appear anywhere. The word development appears in exactly two places, in Article 38 and in 243. And in one place, it is about how urban municipalities should have the democratic power and the right to create development plans for ensuring social justice at the local level. And the other article says the same thing for the village. But otherwise, there's no mention of development. So that which has become a mantra in the last 20-25 years, regardless of who has been in power, whether it's the UPA or the NDA, the exact leadership in India does not matter. But they have repeated a mantra which was not born in this country. They have repeated a mantra which was actually created in Washington. And that mantra goes back all the way to the creation of the World Bank in 1944, which is when the idea of development as we know it was hatched. And the US President of the time, Harry Truman, in 1949, in his inaugural address, talks about development and about countries which are underdeveloped in the world and how they need our help and so on. So development is an idea of imperial coinage, which our suborned leadership in this country, whether it's Congress or BJP, is completely irrelevant because they're both completely suborned to Washington. Okay, the whole vision has been borrowed from the West. It's an imperial vision inflicted on a yet poor country. The number of poor has grown dramatically. There's over 700 or 800 million poor people in India. It's at least twice the size of the country's population at the time of independence. These are facts which no one can deny. These are facts which should have stirred us to a completely different imagination, a completely indigenous, autonomous, Indian civilization-based imagination about how to bring about a good society. Development is just one way to transform a society. Growth is the best way to destroy a society today. And India has embraced this path with complete confidence, as though we really know what we are talking about. Now to come to your question as to whether growth is even possible. The problem is this. In abstract terms, it's very easy to do the algebra and the arithmetic and to show that numerically numbers can keep growing larger and larger and larger in the abstract dimension. So long as they don't stand for anything real and concrete in the physical space of this planet, you can do whatever you want. You can hatch as many algebraic fantasies as you please. But when it comes to touching base with something real, which is to say the earth, physical space, physical objects, trees, plants, animals, rivers, mountains, coastlines, and so on. If you translate that abstract ambition to this concrete realm, and simply look upon everything as a resource here on, including human beings. We have no shame anymore about calling human beings human resources. We create ministries for them. We have no shame about calling society social sector. You departmentalize the whole of human society and it becomes a social sector. You reduce the whole of God's, earth, and you call it the environment. You imagine that you're in control. You think you're building a smarter planet. In fact, you're creating a more stupid society. That's what you're actually doing. You're not able to teach students the difference between cows and beef and so on. There are many children who believe in this world today that cows yield beef the way they yield milk. Now, this is the kind of fundamental conceptual misunderstanding and ecological confusion you create when you bring up children in supermarkets, when they don't have forests and pastures and mountains and meadows to look at, when they don't look at anything real before they start seeing something imaginary or false. Then they start thinking of the imaginary and the false as the most real thing, and so on. So numerically, you can show whatever you wish. You can prove growth is possible forever, etc. In actual fact, we know, and we know for at least a generation and a half, that on a finite planet, endless growth is not possible. If we try to attempt it, we will ruin human society. The planet will be fine, by the way. So when President Obama says we are trying to save the planet, no. We are trying to make human society more intelligent and adaptable to a planet which is whipping us. The elements are whipping us today, but we don't notice it. We don't reckon in the evidence as something which is man-made. I always say that we as human beings can't argue with supermarkets and expressways and shopping malls. But the elements are doing it all the time. Whether it's floods or cyclones or hurricanes, they're arguing with them all the time and winning every time. But we don't seem to weigh that into our thinking. Our thinking does not change as a result of these massive ecological events taking place all around us. Our television screens are flooded with them. So, growth in the sense in which it has been going on for these 200 to 250 years rests on premises which are now, in a state of shock. And for anybody watching, those premises have changed quite dramatically. So, what we really need to think about is how do we make a transition? How do we make a transition to a viable, hospitable world where human civilization would still be possible at a reasonably decent, level of life. That is not guaranteed anymore, given the range of destructive technologies and possibilities all around us. The species needs to realize the limits of its intelligence and needs to realize the ways in which it hasn't actually explored its intelligence. For instance, we need a whole new imagination. We need a whole new ecological imagination to create completely new kinds of economies for the future, where, for instance, you won't be driving 50 or 100 miles to work every day as so many people do in this world today, where you would be living right next to your workplace and so on, where you won't need to travel around the world looking for the best soccer game simply because you have the money. You are happy to burn up so much jet fuel looking for the best soccer game, where you will be more interested in playing the soccer with the kids in your neighborhood than watching your favorite superstars in live action on some other continent. So that's the kind of consumer indulgence that has created this stupid society that we live in. And this will have to go. This will need to change. Well, there are many reasons for that. First of all, there is the general inertia of human societies. Facts and real life is usually ahead of us. We are always behind. The problems are always ahead, especially in a turbocharged technological age where things change so fast. Problems are created much faster, and we live today with not a problem solving but a problem creating way of life. When somebody is digging the hole much faster than any of us can fill it, we have to face that. Unless we hold the elbow that is drilling the hole in the ground much faster than anyone can fill it, it's all hopeless. The black hole will keep growing. Now, imagine a world in which children are educated properly, which is to say, they're made familiar with the facts which we are talking about. They are made familiar with all the arguments which we are giving. What would that amount to? That would amount to a society which constantly questions its governments and corporations. Who would like that? Everybody except the governments and the corporations, right? But therefore, both governments and corporations will be heavily funding the opposite, right? Which is to say, you create a dumb society where everybody is thinking wrong about the most obvious things which are not difficult to think right about, but because everybody around you, thanks to the advertising and the propaganda, is thinking wrong about it, it's almost fashionable to think wrong about it. It's almost fashionable to not waste. It's not kosher to conserve things, and so on. So you create a world in which there is a strange incentive to be stupid. You create a structurally irresponsible society. Okay? And that's the effect of 24/7, 30, 365 advertising. It creates a dumb society. I'm putting it very bluntly, but that's the fact. Even when you know that an ad is dumb, okay, you still listen, you still watch, because everybody around you is watching. Human beings are turned into herd animals. Nobody has the courage to think for themselves, to hold an opinion in a minority of one. They don't want to stand out, they don't want to stick out, etc. So this is not the way you will ever find solutions. This is the way the problem will continue, and will continue unacknowledged. We are not in touch with the fundamentals anymore. We do not live in a scientific society anymore. We live in a technological society. We are too enamored of how much the human mind has achieved and how great it is, and so on. All that feeds our vanity and pride, but actually takes us farther from the truth. If this is the way scientists always were, science would not have reached this point. You have to be humble in order to learn something from nature, in order to learn the ways of nature, which are always mysterious. Nature will tease things. You have to tease things out of nature in order to learn something. Nature will not reveal its secrets just like that. There are too many blinders inside us. There are too many illusions inside us. And this smarter planet crowd wants to keep building these illusions to the point of no return, where only they will have the answers to problems which only then they will have control over, to the extent that they do. And everybody else will look like dumb, if that happens. So we have created a very strange society which calls itself democratic and pretends to be free, but freedom is the last thing which can find a home in a world like this. See, the way I understand global planetary industrial civilization today is as a massive, gigantic, endless, bleeding white elephant. That's how I envisage it. There are parts of the elephant which are more alive than others. Okay, those are the parts controlled by the corporations and governments and anybody in a position of privilege. But if you look at what's happening to frontier communities, which are having to face the brunt of floods, of cyclones, of hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., they're in constant jeopardy. They are the sort of poster signs for the future. Those are the early warning signs. Now, those are parts of the elephant which are bleeding very badly. Why are they bleeding? Because we are living the way we do. Things are so totally interdependent in this world ecologically that if rich people and privileged people are going to go on with cricket matches under lights and strobes and go on looking for the best soccer games around the planet, then some people somewhere will be having to pay the price, or future generations will, or other species will. All those costs are unreckoned because none of these people, whether it's the poor, whether it's the unborn, whether it's other species, have any market voice. Now you've created this stupid tyrannical society which basically gives all power to the market, which means all power to who has the dollars today, not tomorrow, but today, right? And in that sort of a world, you will get systematically, ecologically irrational decisions being taken time after time after time. So if you go and speak to frontier communities, which I have from time to time in this country, whether it's tribals defending the rainforests in Orissa, or some other tribes defending rivers in Chhattisgarh, or some other groups fighting for forests in Goa, or tribes in the Himalayas. I mean, they're all struggling somehow to survive in the face of the onslaught of development. The juggernaut of development is not working for them. It's working for those of us who have the privilege to live in a metropolitan city and who have one leg in the metropolitan city, another leg in another country, not a single toe in our own villages. So there was a time when Mahatma Gandhi used to say, India lives in its villages. Today it has moved to the shopping malls and to the airports around the globe. Where the hell will you find India outside of that today? Nowhere. All our elite is moving in this dimension, which is a totally fantasy-filled world, right? The reality is not known to them. The ecological realities of the day, they might read about it in a newspaper column and say, oh, these are ecological fundamentalists, leave them aside. They're loonies, they're doomsdayers. They don't even know what doomsday looks like. By the time it hits them, as it did, for instance, Mumbai in 2005, or Uttarakhand in 2013, or Kashmir this year, it's too late, So, and these are all educated, privileged people with all the access to information and education that anybody could have in this world. And they're so poorly informed about what's going on. And if they are informed and they still go on saying and doing the same things they were doing till yesterday, what's the point of getting the education in the first place? So you have a large number of vested interests. To put it very bluntly, if your mouth is stuffed with, chocolate, maybe there is a fire, growing around you, but you're not going to notice it if somebody else is taking the heat for the time being. It's only when your chocolate begins to melt that you might notice that the fire is important, but by that time it's too late. The game will be up for you. But that's the kind of ecologically stupid world we have created now, and we seem to be quite happy in that muck. One way in which societies are going down when there is a shortfall of resources is through war. It's exactly through war. People start, like rats in a sack, they start fighting with each other for the little that remains. You see poor communities doing it quite often. I see it in front of my house every morning when the water tanker comes to give water to the slum people every day, or when there's real water shortage, it doesn't even come every day. So war is actually very often a symptom of vanishing resources. And one has to take decisions in such a way that you preempt that kind of conflict. Very often foreseeable, okay? But we don't like to prevent, we don't like to say no. Our modern definition of freedom, thanks to the advertisers, is the more you consume, the more free you are. It doesn't matter what health effects you suffer or what other price somebody else pays for your consumption. None of that is important. What I want and what I feel and what I desire is the most important thing. So war is clearly one of the consequences of a restless, greedy world which has not learned to limit itself materially. There are other ways in which nature settles the equation. The United States, for instance, a few years ago had a major hurricane, Superstorm Sandy. The most advanced, the most mechanized, technologically developed society in the world. And here was this, storm basically blowing through the Atlantic seaboard of the east coast of the US and disrupting just about every man-made system, We tend to take industrial modernity so much for granted, and we have so much confidence in ourselves that we think that these power lines and these railway tracks and these airports and these shopping areas, all these things are safe and secure. And nothing of that is real. And when Superstorm Sandy came on, people were trapped in their homes in New Jersey amidst floods for weeks on end, sometimes without food and medicine, and people lost their lives, New York, I was there a few years ago, and the whole subway line from Manhattan to Queens has been shut down because of flooding from Superstorm Sandy. the flood waters being salty, they don't have the money to repair, And that's the case with a lot of American infrastructure. It's collapsing, and governments do not have the resources to actually maintain it at the minimum level. In our own country, I recently took a train trip somewhere, and you realize how much more pressure there is on the tracks, not just because of more population, but because people have simply started moving and traveling much more, Other than the fact that the goods trains, the freight-bearing trains, the coal trains which bring the coal from Jharkhand or Odisha or Chhattisgarh to the industrial towns in Madhya Pradesh or Maharashtra or Gujarat, the pressure of these freight trains on the tracks has grown dramatically. And the total length of tracks in the country has not grown very much at all in the last so many decades. And the government doesn't have the money to maintain these tracks, which means what? Which means there will be more accidents, which means there will be more mishaps in the future. And what is that showing to us? What that is showing to us is we are living way beyond our means. We simply don't have the resources to actually live this lavish life which we pretend to live. But every single ad in the newspapers and on television is saying to you, you can live like those in Shanghai, and you can live like those in Rome and Paris and so on. So, you can't have these few Californian islands in a sea of sub-Saharan misery, which India has become. It's a sure sign of ecological decline. This imbalance will be corrected by nature. If you look at a tree, it doesn't bear all its fruit on one side, If it bears all its fruits on one side, the tree will one day fall, under the weight of its own excess, right? So that's the kind of society that India has become, and not just India, but Brazil and South Africa, where I visited a few years ago. Many parts of the world have become extremely unequal, and the world as a whole has become extremely unequal. We live on many different planets while being on the same one. And there is a time to reckon with the fact that we are all actually sharing a certain ecological fate on the same planet, to come to the same page on it with less privileged people in our own species is one way in which you actually cut to the chase and you start facing what is real. If we don't do that, then I'm sorry, our children and grandchildren are going to hate us for being very irresponsible and immature. Yeah, well, if you look at the history of terrorism, the word is old, but its practical usage is not older than, say, a generation and a half or so. From the 1970s mostly, but especially since the 1980s. It actually concerns the denial of autonomy and freedom to people in oil-producing countries. They happen to be Arabs or Muslims, that's secondary. The main point is that here you have imperial forces rooted in Washington and London and so on, trying to control a region very far from them in order to control the main resource which fuels their civilization and creates as a byproduct a very large disaffected population which is angry with the dictatorships which are supported by Washington and London. What do you expect those people to do except revolt? Take to arms ultimately, So, to cut a very long story short, and Washington itself, by the way, has played a huge hand in promoting terrorism when it suited them. For instance, when they were trying to topple the Soviets in Afghanistan, they trained, and the CIA trained and armed, what later on became, the Mujahideen and Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and that comes back to haunt them. Now, who is going to argue today with the fact that Al-Qaeda comes out of oil-based politics? Are they separable? No, they're not. So terrorism is one manifestation, absolutely, of the fact that you're trying to live unsustainably. It's one form that the whole thing takes. The other thing that happens, like you said, is the demand for secession. That has happened in many parts of the world, from Africa to our parts of the world as well. When a region in a country realizes that its resources are being stolen by others, and it is not having the chance to grow and develop like them. On the contrary, it is having to face all the downsides of their development. It revolts. And I think you're likely to see some of that in our own country. You're already seeing signs of that in Chhattisgarh and other places, and you will see more of that. There are rebellions right now. I was just watching on a YouTube video just now in Odisha, where people who are being asked to move to allow coal mining. There are dozens of villages, and thousands of people came out in protest, came out for the public hearing on the mining project in Angul district in Odisha against Adani Corporation, and basically saying, to hell with you. We are not going to give our land, and we lay down our lives. You can kill us. And they're surrounded by paramilitary forces. These are not paramilitary forces working for the people of this country. These are paramilitary forces working for corporate India. Okay. Now it's corporate India which wants to turf these villagers out. They can't give them jobs because they don't use technologies which need those people. So what are you promising them? Some compensation, some money which their children can blow up in alcohol or gambling or something, and you expect them to be happy with that? So they're going to fight. So in this particular case, they managed to, stop things at this public hearing, but it doesn't mean that corporates and Modi's government are going to give up on the whole project. It will continue. They will keep putting pressure on them till such time as people yield. That is their idea of development, that you get rid of environmental clearances, you get rid of all green tape, you're so colorblind you don't even see the difference between green tape and red tape, and you allow all sorts of ecological crimes to happen in the name of development. Such a government is the best enemy a country can have. So you will see a lot more coal rebellions from Goa, from Chhattisgarh, from Jharkhand, from Odisha, and so on. And dare I say, these rebellions are the best safety valve that Indian civilization has. Why? Because if these frontier communities are not there, you can expect people like us living in comfortable metropolitan homes to completely raid these environments of any resources. Since early 1980s, in the last 30 years, India has been destroying 100 full-sized soccer fields worth of forests every single day. Just think of what that means. It's over 1 million hectares of forests that India has been destroying over this whole period. If these frontier communities are not there to fight and to stand in the way, if you don't have that safety valve, if you don't have that early warning control system, we will just destroy the whole thing. In order to do what? In order to watch these soccer games around the planet, in order to play cricket under strobes, and so on. This is the kind of childish, immature behavior that the Indian elite is engaged in today. And we are quite happy to think of ourselves as patriotic while we continue with these consumer hypocrisies. So my point is that your best insurance policy against climate change, against flooding, against deforestation, is that these communities remain there. They are the protectors of our best biological resources. Our entire biodiversity heritage is in their hands, not the forest departments, I'm sorry. So if you're going to kill off these communities, be sure that your turn will come. There's a very beautiful and chilling line in William Blake's Proverbs of Hell. He says, "The dog starved at the master's gate predicts the ruin of the state." Now that should send a chill up Modi's spine, and if that does not, then he doesn't need to be Prime Minister. Yeah, as long as the greater common good is in Bollywood and in our cricket team and in the PMO's staff and so on, if that is our sense of the people, then yes, you do need to have large numbers of people sacrificing so that the emperor can ride his elephant. But if you have any rational, sane, humanitarian, ethical sense of a greater common good, your first duty is to ensure that you don't create ecological refugees in your development model. You know, if your development model is going to routinely generate ecological refugees, you have to know you're doing something criminally wrong, you know, for which you actually should resign. Okay, they don't see that that they have any responsibility in the matter. Okay, and they think that just by putting enough people in jail, they'll be able to stop them and crush their dissent. They will fail. They will fail. It'll take time for that truth to emerge, but they will fail. Sure, sure. I mean, so far, the West has been living on a high imperial plinth, where its consumption levels are orders of magnitude above the rest of the world. How has it done that? It has done that not only with very inventive and intelligent, from their perspective, technology, intelligent within a certain limited range, right? But more importantly, it has done that by exploiting the resources of the whole globe. When the West industrialized, the world was not a democracy. It was able to forcibly move large numbers of people from the countryside to the cities in order to ensure its industrial growth. In order to create mines, in order to create its roads and infrastructure for industry, it forcibly moved large numbers of peasants and others. It also, relied throughout on the resource base of the whole planet, because of colonialism, imperialism, war, conquest. None of that is incidental to this modern form of industrialization. Now, neither India nor China are countries which have colonies today. So they will try to grab land in Africa as much as you can. And for the rest of the time, you basically eat into your own stomach, which is to say you kill off your own people in order to impress the whole world with how rich you've become and how developed you've become. And it's all vain because, it will not be tolerated by nature ultimately. So development, if it goes on like this for another generation, will destroy India. It's the end of Indian civilization as we know it. And I'm not dramatizing it, I'm saying it like I know it, okay? If we do not want to face this fact, we are just childish and stupid. That's all one can say. The outsourcing of costs in terms of resource cost, pollution cost, exporting your dirty industries, your garbage, that outsourcing of cost, which the West has been doing for a very long time now, is what has allowed it to keep its own corner clean physically. So when we visit the West, we don't see the waste dumps. But you travel to the Pacific garbage patch, you travel to the Five Gyres in the ocean, and you see the millions and millions of tons of plastic that the West has created from its industrial excess. And you see the destruction of aquatic life, the destruction of biodiversity. If you ask children or even older people today, where does most of our oxygen on this planet comes from? Most people will not be able to give you the right answer. And they might point to trees and so on. But actually most of our oxygen comes from the algae in the ocean. If the oceans get acidified with climate change and more carbon makes its way into the oceans, that means less oxygen on the planet. Okay, that means you've ruined everybody's chances. This is not an externality as idiot economists think about it. It's, internal to the ecology of everybody's life on planet today. So the whole way of thinking is wrong. The whole way of thinking that the West has taught the world is flawed, has shown itself to be lapsed today. We can't afford to think like that. Sustainability of what? Sustainability of this kind of nonsense? It will not be tolerated. There is a higher court of justice than humanity, and it belongs to the elements. The elements work from within us, the elements work from outside us. We think ourselves very powerful, but it just takes a few microbes, bacteria, and viruses in the wrong place to destroy us. It happens all the time. We don't want to accept it. But the truth is, humanity is extremely vulnerable. Okay, the planet will be fine, it'll go on rotating and revolving as it has been for millennia and centuries. But we are the ones who are going to go on suffering, and our children, So what the West has been experiencing for some time recently, a wave of protests, whether it's the Occupy movement or the protests in Athens or Madrid or Romania, these are only early symptoms. I think the West has a lot to unlearn, much more to unlearn than the rest of the world. And they'll go through a rather stiff process of unlearning, which will be painful. It'll be painful because of the number of illusions people have. You know, it's not easy to give up illusions for creatures of symbolic representation. It's normal to have illusions and to confuse them with the real thing. I think we have far fewer illusions in India, and when I say far fewer illusions in India, I don't refer to our educated elites who have the most illusions in the world. I refer to our poor illiterate peasants and forest dwellers and fishermen who can't afford to have too many illusions. They live right on the ecological frontier. They live exposed to the elements. They know what things cost. We just know what things taste like. You know, we just know their upsides. So I think one has to remember what country one is living in and try and live somewhat by the lessons of the civilization that country belongs to. Well, they stuff our mouths. It's very simple. I mean, you know, if I can live like this, why would I want to change anything? If the air can be reasonably clean and the water can be, you know, rendered clean by our ROs and so on. You know, when we were kids, there was no RO, there was no need for filtration, there were no water bottles 25, 30 years ago, and we were quite healthy. We grew up much healthier than kids do today with all the ROs in the world. So, you know, the whole way of controlling human behavior and thought has changed in recent times, thanks to the invasion of television and communication technologies. In the past, colonialism needed guns, either guns in use or guns at the ready, you know, in order to threaten people and so on. What the Americans have found is that's not the best way to control people. A much subtler, much easier way to control people is to stuff their faces and to give them lots of candies and lots of, you know, pizzas and lots of holidays on some Pacific island, and they'll all be bribed into silence and bribed into stupidity. They will not be interested in rebelling, let alone be able to rebel. So that's what has happened to our middle classes and elites. We've been cretinized by the American impact in the last 25 years. And once you've cretinized the people and their culture, you can manipulate them in hundreds of ways. There's a very powerful insight in one of Rabindranath's essays. He says that the vices that bring down the strong bring down the weak even faster. So if America is on a 30-degree slope, India is on a 90-degree slope or a 70-degree slope. So our work is much harder in that sense, in one sense. In another sense, America has a lot more unlearning to do, and their task is going to be much harder. But in certain ways, in terms of, you know, as a culture, our task is much harder because we have been under colonial control for 300 years now. I do not believe for a moment that India was liberated in 1947. There was a transfer of power from the white elite to the brown elite. Colonial methods, colonial structures of power, this famous Hindutva rise to power in 2014, what does it rely on? It relies on a completely British colonial administration, which is still in place, whether it's the IAS or the IPS, the whole penal code, everything is colonial about this country. The whole imagination is colonized, the whole mind is colonized. So where is India in all this? Where is Hindustan? Where is Bharat? Only in the fantasies of the RSS, and that's all. Precisely. They have sold us their story as though it's our story. That's the way in which they have infantilized us. We do not know anymore in this country what is in our interest. What is really in our long-term interests, I'm afraid we do not know. The Chinese know it somewhat, and they know it somewhat because they've never been physically colonized. They've never been completely mentally colonized. They've always retained a sphere of autonomy. But even in China, because of the entry of a certain kind of economic system and modern methods, quote unquote modern methods, the Chinese way of life has become a colonial way of life. It is bound to create more inequality, more unrest, more dissatisfaction, more distrust, breakdown of human communities, relationships. All that is happening in China, Japan, and elsewhere too. So I look upon it as a cancer. The cancer originates hundreds of years back in Europe and has now spread to the whole world. I mean, I'm not saying that everything was beautiful and hunky-dory and romantically lovely 300, 400 years ago. The world had its problems. Humanity's always had problems. But this kind of apocalyptic future was not facing all of humanity all at the same time as it does today. So with the spread of that cancer, the imagination for a new world, for a completely new way of life, which would actually liberate humanity from consumer servitude and material desires and so on, while meeting all material needs that humanity has, rationally speaking, sensibly speaking, that is to be done. I mean, that is the task for the future. I mean, the transition from an industrial to an ecological civilization is what our and the next and the following generations have to achieve. The past is helpful in that, more by way of sobering lessons than by way of simple blind imitation. But there is a huge challenge before the imagination to think a new world. That new world has to be thought. Well, we got to the party late for one very simple reason which had nothing to do with us. It has to do with the end of communism. Communism comes to an abrupt end in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Till that time, capitalism had to perform on social indicators in comparison with its rival. It could not simply ride roughshod over all other values, all other needs. When I say all other, I mean beyond profit and greed, right? After 89, it has traveled across the planet untrammeled, no opposition. It stands alone as the preeminent economic system. You don't even need to name it. How many people do you hear today who argue the concept of capitalism? Just when it needs to be argued with most fiercely, there is nobody saying there's something fundamentally messy and wrong and stupid about this way of doing things. Nobody's saying it. Let's be clear about one thing first. I'm not a socialist. I'm not a communist. I'm not a leftist for that matter. Philosophically, I'm not even a materialist. Okay, I feel much closer to someone like Rabindranath Tagore, or less so to Mahatma Gandhi. But those would be the nearest people that I would think of in terms of taking a vision from. If you're looking for a vision of how humanity should be living, not just India, then those are the places where I would look. I would not look to Karl Marx. No, Karl Marx was enamored of technology, he was enamored of modernity, he was enamored of a certain kind of progress. Not that I'm enamored of blind tradition. I'm simply saying that modernity, as it has unfolded in the last 100 years, has basically been a terrible ecological stupidity, and we will have to return. We will have to make a U at some point and find some other way. The reason that India has got addicted to the goodies of industrial modernity is quite simply greed. Now, from that age, all of us have grown up in India with one very simple saying, which always comes to my rescue if I feel confused. Lalach buri bala hai. But that's not what Gordon Gekko has taught our children. Greed is supposed to be good. Not only is it supposed to be good, it's supposed to be the only good. All else is bad. So that's the kind of dystopian moral world in which our children are growing up, right? This will have to be fought. Unfortunately, this will have to be fought. And when I say fought, I don't mean violently. I mean intelligently. Violence is the most stupid thing that human beings do. Violence is what human beings do when all intelligence deserts them. That's when they start threatening and they start accumulating armaments and so on. And that kind of imbecility can only hasten ecological destruction. What I would suggest is that we start looking upon ourselves as extremely vulnerable beings, extremely vulnerable creatures, gifted with some intelligence, not a whole lot, and a lot of wisdom to learn by way of the limits of that intelligence. So, the first thing to understand about India's tryst with consumerism in the last 20, 25 years is that the modern industrial world has entered us through a very simple back door. It's called greed. So we have to face that, and we have to face that in all its multifarious complexity and intricacy, because greed is not just material. Greed could be for power. I mean, all our politicians are basically gluttonous for power. Greed could be for fame, or celebrity status, or some stupid thing. I mean, Bollywood is full of it, and so on. So all that sort of indoctrination into what I would call Homo consumerists, as against Homo sapien. The word sapien is very interesting. It comes from a Latin word called sapiente, which means to taste. And to taste what? To taste something of wisdom. That's the origin of the word Homo sapien. From there, we become Homo consumerists. Been there, done that, tasted it, felt great. Recommend you do the same. So Homo consumerists, and the other half of it is Homo abstractus today, which interacts with the world through screens and develops all sorts of fantasies and pseudo identities in its travels across cyberspace, getting more and more ecologically alienated from the world around it. And I'm using the word "it" very advisedly, because sometimes you feel like we are no longer human. We've simply become cyborgs or robots when we interact with each other through these screens and machines, through the networks. And a network is not a community. So all this baggage, this whole world has entered India only recently, and it has charmed India. It has charmed India to the point of abject cultural servitude. Those are the only words that come to mind, because we have a sort of vainglorious pride in some distant ancient past which our politicians keep invoking. We have no living, real connection with that past. And if some people still do have that living, real connection, we ignore them. If they know how to live happily with nature, if they know what is the meaning of a sacred plant like tulsi or neem, if they know what it's like to treat animals with sacred respect. I mean, you look at our religious lore and it's full of, whether it's the Nandi bull or the Garuda, or, there are any number of animal symbols in our mythologies, in our Panchatantra, in the Jataka tales, and so on. All that has to be brought back. I do not believe for a minute that the Hindutva brigade can be the right people to bring it back, because they're modernists. They want to make India into a powerful superpower in a planet that does not exist. That's their fantasy. It's just like the Mujahideen and the fundamentalists on the other side. So, and I'm not a secularist. So you cannot accuse me of secularism because I'm a believer. I think that the people running this country are not believers, and I can argue that some other time. So I feel that the whole growth story needs to be retold as a greed story. And it'll make much more sense to us when we have to look into that mirror, no matter how dirty we have made it. The greed story is needed in order to keep the growth story going. What looks like growth to people is actually greed. Okay? And it's so obstinate because it is married to the beautiful idea of freedom. And so long as you're allowed to be greedy, you believe yourself to be free today. You can consume the hell out of the earth. So my way of summarizing our times is think parochially, consume globally. Get your fish from the North Sea, get your beef from Amazonia, get your wine from the south of France, take your holidays in Italy, and think in a fundamentalist Hindu or a fundamentalist Muslim way. This is what modern humanity has become in this country. This is pathetic. This is dreadful. This is ugly, stupid. This is not what human beings are for. So my way of understanding the last 25 years is that we've been seduced into the growth story through the back door of greed, which has neon lights which say freedom, and people believe that that is real freedom. In fact, they've been invited into a new servitude, into a greater dependency, into more and more unskilling and de-skilling, more and more dumbing down, more and more alienation from your own food, your own clothing, your own culture, your own civilization, your own language, your own past. Okay, no respect for any of that. Let's all learn English badly, join, Pax Americana, be on the networks, become beautiful and sexy. This is modern India, and it's got nothing to do with India.